Welcome to the latest episode of the MFG Radio Network's Manufacturing Matters, where industry experts take deep dives into the latest technologies you need to consider to keep manufacturing moving.
Hello, and welcome to today's Aerospace Industry 2023 Outlook Spring, presented by Richard Abalafia, brought to you by Aerospace Manufacturing and Design Magazine. I'm Eric Brothers, editor for the magazine and the webinar moderator. Richard offers insights on the rapidly changing market conditions affecting aerospace markets as we head into the summer and the latest edition of the Paris Air Show. Our presenter, Richard Abalafia, fellow of the Royal Aeronautical Society, is Managing Director, Aerodynamic Advisory of Ann Arbor, Michigan. We've asked him to share what he sees for the aerospace markets, both commercial and defense, from the perspective of spring 2023. As many of you know already, Mr. Abalafia is a widely respected aviation industry expert and contributed to Aerospace Manufacturing and Design's annual forecast issue. He manages consulting projects in the commercial and military aircraft field and analyzes broader defense and aerospace trends. He's advised numerous aerospace companies, including most prime and many second and third tier contractors in the US, Europe, and Asia. He also advises numerous financial institutions on aerospace market conditions. Frequently cited as an aviation industry authority by trade and news publications, Richard has appeared on numerous television news and radio programs, including ABC, BBC, Bloomberg, Reuters, CBS, CNN, NBC, NPR, and PBS. Before we begin, we'd like to thank our sponsors. ISCAR is the largest of the 15 companies comprising IMC, International Metalworking Companies, and has been a leader for nearly 70 years in the development of a dynamic and comprehensive line of innovative precision carbide metalworking tools. They have developed industry-specific solutions to optimize productivity. They understand the unique requirements of each industry and continually improve and introduce new ideas for machining intelligently. Renishaw is a global leader in developing technology that supports manufacturing process control. Renishaw offers an advanced range of calibration, measurement, positioning, and inspection solutions. Specified by leading OEMs around the world, Renishaw encoders, calibration, and measurement systems enable superior process control down to nanometer and picometer levels. We'd also like to thank Chiron Group, is known worldwide for its vertical milling and milling turning machining centers, as well as for its turnkey and automation expertise. Around 1,900 employees face complex challenges every day and develop future-proof solutions with passion. Chiron Group is a world leader in the machine tool space with the ability to create structural and prismatic components. Chiron America is ITAR approved and a key player within OEMs for the aerospace industry. To operate with confidence in this difficult field, you need production concepts for the future. Manufacturing solutions from the Chiron Group further streamline operating procedures for maximum efficiency. Heidenhain develops and manufactures linear encoders, angular encoders, rotary encoders, digital readouts, and numerical controls. For more than 125 years, Heidenhain has delivered the trusted precision measurement and motion control solutions behind machines and devices that move us forward. Makino is the industry leader in machinery design and digital innovation. Makino produces the world's most accurate and highest quality metal cutting and EDM machines. Their promise of performance is rooted in old school pride and relentless craftsmanship in everything they do. Nagata Engineering, founded in 1895, is the oldest existing horizontal-focused machine tool builder in Japan. Known for their significant performance and advancements, Nagata's high-rigidity boxway 5-axis trunnion series solutions for complex aerospace and defense applications are equipped with a one-piece casting trunnion table. Both ends of the table are supported by robust roller bearings and worm wheel drives. The mechanical structure emphasizes stable machining accuracy throughout the work envelope. High horsepower and torque allow you to take full advantage of the rigid machine frame. For hard metals, high torque heavy-duty spindles are available with up to 1,438 foot-pounds of torque. Solar Atmosphere provides commercial vacuum heat treating and brazing surfaces in markets including aerospace and defense. With more than 60 vacuum furnaces from lab size to 48 feet long with 150,000-pound capacity, Solar Atmospheres can handle any size job. It operates plants in eastern and western Pennsylvania, California, and South Carolina, all ISO 9001:2015 and AS 9100D and NADCAP registered for heat treating. Walter is one of the world's leading metalworking companies. As provider of specialized machining solutions, Walter offers a wide range of precision tools for milling, turning, drilling, and threading applications. Walter works together with customers to develop custom solutions for fully machining components for use in the aviation and aerospace industries, as well as automotive, energy, and general engineering. Demand for air travel is surging and even eclipsing pre-pandemic levels. Airlines are ordering new airliners to accommodate that demand and put more fuel-efficient engines in service. They're embracing sustainability, the net zero emissions goal the industry is seeking by 2050. While single-aisle commercial jets dominate the market, some orders have appeared recently for wide-body jetliners. Can the aerospace and original equipment manufacturers keep up their planned production rates? And are supply chain bottlenecks a thing of the past? Defense and aerospace markets are benefiting from continued anxiety over events in Eastern Europe and a widespread desire to upgrade fighter jets. Concern about developments in the Asia-Pacific region are also generating interest in procurement of modern defensive capabilities in aircraft and missiles. While the growth in inflation and uptick in fuel prices have moderated since our last update, interest rates continue to rise with every meeting of the Federal Reserve Board. Can our economic policy reduce inflation and hold off recession? We asked Richard once again to explain what our members of the aerospace supply chain need to know to prepare for what's ahead through the summer of 2023. Richard?
Thank you very much, Eric. Thanks for hosting. Thanks for the introduction. Thanks to Aerospace Manufacturing and Design. And of course, thanks to our sponsors today. And of course, to all of you for coming and listening. I've got a weird job these days. After effectively doing the same thing for about 35 years, I find myself in a very strange place where the markets that I'm supposed to track are doing just great, with one medium exception. All the other markets are they're basically hot for all the reasons that Eric just alluded to. The problem for the first time in my 35 years is on the manufacturing side, just getting stuff built. And that is really the complicating factor behind our industry today. And we try to walk you through why things are so good on the market side and why they're not so good on the production side. Next page, please. First of all, my blizzard of numbers that shows what should be an all black situation. You look at the evolution of the various segments of the aviation business with single aisle and twin aisle jetliners there at the top, total at the bottom. Obviously, you had some very bad times between 19 and 21 because of the pandemic. A lot of that due to production disruptions rather than market problems, but it was a 28% drop in aggregate, and jetliners hit particularly hard, particularly twin aisle jets. A lot more on this later. Typically, what you see after a drop like that is a full-throated double-digit recovery. And oh my dear God, we did not get that last year. We got a 9.7% recovery, and it's worse than that. If you look at single aisle and twin aisle jets, they were double-digit, but a lot of that was delivery of jets that had already been built, particularly Boeing 737 MAXs and a few Boeing 787s. So the manufacturing sector didn't really enjoy any, or more than about half, I should say, of that double-digit jetliner market recovery. We had the weakest recovery ever, 9.7%. And if you reduce that to just manufacturing, it would only be like 4 or 5%, something really feeble. The biggest warning sign of all is look at the military side. It was actually down 2.3% in a world where, as Eric said, everyone wants weapons because of the tensions that have emerged in the return of great power competition and everything going on with Russia's Ukraine invasion and whatever else. Why was it down rather than in the black? Believe it or not, that was just 7 aircraft. That was 7 F-35s that couldn't be delivered because of a flight test halt that took place in Fort Worth due to concerns about flight control software. If it weren't for those 7 planes, we would have at least broken even. But in general, everything is struggling with terrible supply chain difficulties, the likes of which, again, I haven't seen in my career. I hope I never do see this again either. This is just one of those strange moments in the evolution of our industry. Next page, please. You've seen the headlines, right? It's all about the supply chain, the labor supply. People talk, I'll walk you through the various components and raw materials that are supply constrained later on in this presentation. But, a lot of it comes down to labor, right? Getting the people, because we lost a lot of good people. The labor market in general is pretty darn tight. And we're kind of on the commercial side, last to hire. And not only that, we were facing demographic challenges in this business for quite some time before. And that's primarily a function of the end of the Cold War. Predictably, especially in areas where you had, a high degree of union control, seniority kind of kicked in, and older people stuck around in the 90s. A lot of young people were let go. They started getting hired back at some point, but you had this demographic bathtub. And then all of a sudden, during the pandemic, everybody in all tiers of the supply chain fired a lot of people, as you might expect they would have to, given the fact that they were all convinced that, the sky was falling. And for a few months, it sure felt like that. But we went too far, and demographics are really challenging right now. Now, the biggest example I can think of, I'm fascinated by this. If you were to look at market demand for the F-35, everyone wants one. Even the European countries with their own fighter planes want them. Germany ordered 35 last year. Most recently, Romania and Thailand. You're getting to second and third tier countries that are starting to pay $100 million for a fighter plane. It's a popular product. If you could flick a switch and build them to market demand, you'd see 200 a year plus rolling off the lines in Fort Worth. Instead, production is, the goal is 156. Last year, they were hoping to get above 150. They made it to 141. They were going to do 147 to 153 this year. Lockheed Martin just walked that back. It looks like it'll be somewhere in the mid 140s. Maybe next year, 156. People want 200. People want 200 and more. And this is a major challenge because, of course, you've got a lot of international partners and allies expecting this jet for reasons of wanting to feel secure about their own borders. Whether it's Japan, South Korea, Finland, Canada, whoever, everyone wants this jet, and we're having a hell of a time building it. So that to me is the best example. Boeing's high profile efforts to get to 31 737 MAXs per month. You saw the recent headlines about this series of brackets that hold the aft fuselage onto the main body of the aft empennage onto the main body of the fuselage of the jet, not built with the right paperwork effectively. That needs to be rectified. It's little hiccups like that are hobbling these production rate increases as we try to get back to where we want to be as an industry. Next page, please. Now, here's what the jetliner part of the industry is doing. It's sort of a fascinating story. You go back to the dawn of the jet age, you always had crazy cycles, 7 good years, 3 bad years, kind of biblical, 7 good years, 3 bad years. And then starting in 2004, we had this amazing super cycle. It got hit in 2019 when the 737 MAX line was halted. But then, of course, you had the apocalyptic 46% drop in 2020, worst we've ever seen. What a feeble recovery in 2022. Not much going on there. And again, that's very heavily a supply chain problem. It turns out that when you cut so deep, you just can't press a button and get back to where you need to be. Next page, please. Now, there's other issues, big picture issues. I've been reading an awful lot about what's happening outside of our industry because you kind of have to these days. And a very interesting piece in Foreign Affairs magazine by Allianz chief economist Dr. Mohammed El Arian. There's the source at the bottom. You can have a look. It's a really interesting article. And he argues that the world today is being defined by 4 big changes. And one of the most interesting from the standpoint of our industry is that for the first time, really since the 1960s, we're going from the world economy being hobbled by inadequate demand to being hobbled by inadequate supply. And boy, is that true for both the civil and military side of our industry. Another major factor, which is going to impact this business in the long run, of course, is China's going dark politically, in terms of ratcheting up tensions in the South China Sea, in terms of cracking down on its own private sector, particularly the tech sector. It's almost like they want to stop growing. They want to be less of a market economy. That's all bad from the standpoint of well, what used to be the most promising jetliner business. And the question I get asked an awful lot, it's a fascinating one, can India be the new China in terms of the fastest growth commercial jetliner market? We'll have to see about that. India faces big challenges too, but the point is that the good old days of China being 23% of jetliner demand in the world, that's going away for a while. Thankfully, the broader market is so strong that we're not worried about that, but we might have to worry about it in a few years. Another problem there on the bottom left, the end of endless liquidity, particularly in the form of cheap interest rates. As Eric alluded to earlier, we don't know how high they're going to have to go. More on this in a bit. It looks like things are moderating. Inflation's coming down a little bit. It's possible that we'll be able to hold the line at 4% interest rates, which isn't bad. That would be great, but there's a lot of uncertainty. And with that comes the impact on company debt. To survive the pandemic, a lot of the people that the good people in this audience sell machine tools to are in the second and third tier of the industry. And to survive the pandemic, they had to do everything they could. They had to fire lots of people. They had to sell off everything that wasn't nailed down. Most of all, they had to stop spending on capital equipment like machine tools, right? And then, of course, they had to load up on debt. Everyone loaded up their debt revolver, and now interest rates are rising. So as a consequence, one of the biggest risk areas moving forward, it's not the primes, not the Boeings and Airbuses, maybe it's not the first tier either, your Spirit Aerosystems, your GKNs, your Mitsubishis. It's really in the second and third tier. And that's where you're going to see your greatest concern, especially again, as they try to bulk up and buy stuff so they can build things. This is the weak link. And what's also a problem is that a lot of the interesting initiatives that the government tried to help prop up the supply chain, like for example, accelerated contractor payments for defense programs, they've gone away. They did incredible work during 2020 and 2021, but they're kind of gone now. So the second and third tier of the supply chain, they're on their own, and they're off to the bank trying to explain their situation and hoping that the debt service costs on their significant debts don't rise too much. And they're also hoping they don't have to pay too much more for people, because as you know, labor inflation has sort of led the way. As all of you, I expect, realize, people just cost more these days. So anyway, these are the big things to think about when you look at the industry and the industry's ability to get back to where we were. And most importantly, to meet the very strong demand we're seeing. I don't want to say, there are worse problems to have than a weak supply side, because this is devilish, right? But on the other hand, we should take consolation that at least markets are the strongest I've seen them in ever. Next page, please. Now, about interest rates, one of the big determinants of jetliner market fortunes is the difference between the cost of cash and the cost of fuel. You want a world, if you're building and selling jets, and if you're part of the great supply chain that is doing that, you want a world where there's a big gap. You want a world where fuel is kind of expensive, so people want new jets to replace the older, thirstier equipment, and a world where cash is cheap so you can finance it. The majority of new jet transactions are financed by somebody other than the airline themselves, right? Whether it's a bank or whether it's an export credit agency or whether it's a lessor, a very common form of financing. And of course, all of these depend upon reasonable interest rates. So where are we now? Federal fund effective is about 4. Could it go higher? Yeah, could. I mean, as Eric said, every time the Fed meets, we kind of sweat a little. Hopefully not too much higher. Now, in historic terms, that's not the end of the world. I go back to the sort of tail end of the Carter administration there, and you had that horrible combination. This is your classic, stagflation, high oil prices, high inflation, and high interest rates too. We're not there, right? It's not a problem yet. It's a watch this space. We hope interest rates either stabilize or come down. Fuel seems to be staying in a Goldilocks place. $80 a barrel or so for West Texas or Brent crude is really good. It doesn't challenge airlines in making money and getting strong passenger demand, but it sure does incentivize them to replace those older jets with newer stuff that doesn't drink as much. Now, the problem is, look at that middle chart I've inserted. We've had some goofy oil price moments. You might remember April of 2020, when for some reason, for the first time in the history of the world, they were paying you to take oil. I know this was a statistical illusion or a blip or something, but technically speaking, the long-term price of fuel in April 2020 turned negative for a couple of hot seconds. All this to say that even though it's $80 a barrel now, and that's really good, heck, it could be 30 next year. We don't know. Or it could be 150. We don't know. It just looks like, most people are saying things are stabilizing, demand seems to be more predictable, and we're pretty good with the idea of $80 a barrel. That's not a bad price at all. Now, what does that mean from the standpoint of this industry? It means we're in a good place. We have a nice wide gap between fuel and capital, so demand should be strong. Because one thing I didn't show you on this chart, but I think you all know it if you've flown recently, is that demand is great. We're back to 2019 levels in North America, a little bit beyond. The only weak link is China, but they're coming back fast. Intra-Asia is following China. Europe is doing great. Latin America is doing great. We're basically sometime later this year, early next year, we're globally at that 2019 peak. There's nothing to worry about. And airlines have turned profitable again too. So the only thing really you should watch is this. And right now it's in a good place, that gap between cash and fuel. Next page, please. And more good news, people are ordering jets. We've got a very big backlog in this industry. Backlogs aren't what you think in this business. Normally you have a backlog in any other industry and it's hey, why can't you build it? Here, people place orders for long-term requirements. You might place an order for a jet that won't be filled until 2028, quite conceivable. There's stuff on order for 2030. So you keep track of the backlog. The backlog's about 13,000 jets, not bad. However, you also look at that book-to-bill ratio, the difference between orders and deliveries, as a kind of endorsement of how good things are. And predictably enough, in 2020, for the first time in jetliner history, book-to-bill wasn't measurable because there were more cancellations, net orders, than there were new orders. You can see that downward spike. Good news is orders have come roaring back. I think this year too, we'll probably see like a 1.5 or even 2-to-1 book-to-bill ratio between orders and deliveries. So people want new jets. That's what you want, right? Next page, please. Not so good news. One thing we probably should have seen, single aisles, particularly the Boeing 737 MAX and the Airbus A320neo, are simply a lot more capable than their predecessor aircraft. And as a consequence, people are using them more and more on routes that used to be flown by wide bodies. So you look at backlogs, you look at deliveries, boy, wide bodies are falling pretty quick. They're now coming down to about 30% of the market. It used to be about half or more of the market. That's a problem. And this also complicates the production side of things because, of course, there's idle capacity with twin aisles and not enough capacity on single aisles. But you can see this single aisle substitution effect everywhere. Last week, I had the pleasure of flying to Portugal, and I did so on a single aisle. I wasn't thrilled about flying across the Atlantic in a single aisle, not as comfortable, but the economics are there. And at the end of the day, like everyone else, I click on what's most effective, what gets me there at the lowest price. So, it doesn't matter from the airline standpoint. They just want the lowest cost, and narrow bodies are the lowest cost solution. Next page, please. So what's happening right now is the market is coming back in a weird K-shaped recovery. It used to be, like I mentioned, that single aisles and twin aisles were roughly equal. They both collapsed in 2020. And now you can't build single aisles fast enough. You can't order machine tools for them fast enough. You can't build engines for them fast enough. Twin aisles, not so much. You're seeing a bit of an uptick. Eric mentioned a couple of high-profile orders. They're promising, but it's just not the return to the great times we saw in the last decade. It's going to take a long time before twin aisles get back to where they were. Regionals never seem to go very far. However, there's only really one company that builds regional aircraft, Embraer, very good company. They're kind of alone in the market. Over the past 3 years, Bombardier exited. They're just a pure play business jet company now. And Mitsubishi also exited. They were building a Mitsubishi regional jet. That's gone. So it's really just Embraer, and that's fine. They inherit a small market. But everybody else is trying to get this match right and build single aisles. And twin aisles, like I said, it's going to take a while. Next page, please. Now, one problem for Boeing is that order preferences that are favoring single aisles are also favoring large single aisles. And right now, you've got the 737 MAX 10 facing off against the A321neo. And Boeing, I would hope they're acknowledging this, but their CEO does not acknowledge this. Very simply, everyone wants a 321neo, and it is badly outgunning Boeing. So this is the state of play with all jets. And as you can see, Boeing has nothing to worry about except for the 737 MAX 10 versus the A321neo. And if you look at that insert chart, every year it seems more people order a 321neo. So the CEO of Boeing says Boeing's not going to do anything new in that segment for another decade. That tells everybody better get in line to order a 321neo. One of the biggest challenges this industry faces, led by Airbus, is how to build 321neos fast enough. They're putting in capacity as they can. This is what's leading Airbus to want to build 75 per month. Of course, an all-time record by a wide margin for any jet. We think they'll get there sometime around probably 2027, realistically. But it's a headlong rush to build 321neos. In the meantime, of course, Boeing is losing market share. All their other products are fine, but right in that 200-seat single-aisle segment, they are losing out fast. And that's why what was a duopoly 50-50 is quickly becoming a 2/3, 1/3 story. Next page, please. Now, turning to the defense side of things, you're seeing very strong growth here. You look at this is not all countries. If you look at all countries, including, this only includes what you might call allied and addressable markets, people we can sell weapons to. It doesn't include Russia, it doesn't include China, it doesn't include Iran, North Korea. If you look at global defense spending, it keeps hitting records. It exceeded $2 trillion for the first time back in 2021. If you look at just addressable markets from the standpoint of the aerospace industry we work in, it hadn't been doing anything good. It was sort of, moving along. The rise of China kind of sparked things up around 2020. And then, of course, you had Ukraine. And now things are absolutely going as well as you might expect. We're expecting 7% annual growth. I think we're being conservative here. A lot of this is limited by how quickly people can spend it and how quickly people can, get products, i.e. F-35s or tanks or ships. That's the real break here. I think if, again, people could push a button and get their weapons, you'd see this increase in defense spending at a much faster pace. Either way, in terms of global defense from addressable market countries, it's heading to $2.5 trillion by the end of the decade. Next page, please. The US is an interesting illustration of that. Breaking things down, O&M, of course, is your operations and maintenance. That reflects, a world where you have to maintain weapons and send them worldwide. The investment accounts from the standpoint of you and me are really what matters. And that means procurement, the blue line, and the RDT&E line, research and development. Both are at record highs. This year, the request, Congress is going to add money to the request, but the request is a record high, $170 billion in procurement and $145 in research and development, also a record. That high R&D number means that you're going to see a lot of metal being cut in the next decade for programs that are now being developed with that R&D money. As for procurement, again, how quickly can you build stuff, whether it's missiles or whether it's tanks? It's just a question of getting cash through the system and having the industry tool up, because of course the industry had downsized greatly as a response to the end of the Cold War. We are now in the process of figuring out how to gear up for what appears to be the return of great power competition and a world of, well, adversarial relationships, and sadly nothing good, but it's something that I think everyone thinks has to be done. Next page, please. Now, looking at the composition of U.S. military aircraft output, just looking at the fixed wing side, look at F-35s. That's that red segment. Obviously, it's the biggest single segment, and we're having, again, a heck of a problem building them. We think we'll get to 156 in 2 years, and then on, we're going to get to probably 170, 180, somewhere in that zone by the end of the decade. Meantime, the legacy programs aren't going away. FA-18 is probably going away in the next 2 years. Navy doesn't want any more. They want to switch to FA-XX, which will be built in the next decade. The F-15, though, Energizer Bunny, I was a kid when that arrived. It arrived in 1972. It'll be built through the end of the decade. Great plane. At the top, the new programs, T-7 supersonic trainer, and most of all, the B-21 bomber, California's first aircraft since the end of the C-17 program back about 5 years ago. And the B-21 looks like a huge success, and a very expensive huge success. Each aircraft is going to cost about $600 million. Think of it as like a lighter, believe it or not, less expensive B-2 program. And for a time where the U.S. Air Force absolutely positively wants it. Next page, please. Now, talking about the rotorcraft market, it's obviously a strong market compared to the downturn we just went through. A lot of people talk about the impact of new technologies, particularly the V-280 FLRAA. Congratulations to Bell for winning that, the future long-range assault aircraft, FLRAA, future long-range assault aircraft. The V-280 is a tilt rotor design. It won against the coax compound Boeing Sikorsky model back about 3 months ago, I believe. And before you think it's going to take over, compare it to the V-22. The V-22 was arguably the only Cold War aircraft that survived all of the terrible cuts that came with the Cold War, because the Marines are, well, they had a very strong message and a very strong, excuse me, political presence. But nevertheless, the V-22 and tilt rotors did not take over, right? And you still had the V-22 coexist happily with the broader military rotorcraft market, be it Blackhawks or Chinooks or Apaches or whatever else. And we're going to see the same thing. The V-280 will be built in considerable numbers. I would expect at least 400 or 500, but that doesn't mean that it's going to take over everything. So when you see new concepts for rotorcraft, great to be excited by that. And there's certainly new business opportunities like the V-280, but it doesn't mean everything else goes extinct, and it doesn't mean older technologies get instantly displaced. Next page, please. Now, turning to maintenance, repair, and overhaul, obviously an important part of the business. You saw the numbers before. New aircraft production is typically in a non-down year about 180 billion. Well, you know what? So is MRO in 2022. Very important. Spares, repair, overhaul. And here's the breakdown. And we're making a nice recovery into this year. As a matter of fact, this is one of our problems because this is even more labor intensive than new build is, which means, of course, you've got the same demand on labor, the same inflation for labor costs that you do on the new build side. This is challenging, right? But you're seeing CAGRs that are pretty respectable, 2.5% on the military, 5.7% on air transport, and BizAv 3%. I didn't touch on BizAv much, but I should mention that's come out of this pandemic very strong. And you look at Gulfstream, Dassault, Bombardier, Cessna, Embraer, the big five business jet primes, and they're the ones who are actually all above trend in terms of output, in terms of pretty much everything. Next page, please. Now, one big complication And, at this point, like I said at the start, I'm kind of doing forensics on why can't we build stuff? Because markets are so very strong. And one big problem is that we're a little late to the party. The Federal Reserve keeps this marvelous data set, which I have for you at the top slide, non-defense capital goods spending excluding aircraft. That means everything I don't do. Yes, I do take that personally, but it's a useful data set. It's basically everything from cars to, I don't know, tennis to computers to refrigerators. And normally, commercial aircraft leads the way. Normally, we're ahead of this curve. But look at that crazy curve there. You see the recession in that gray bar that accompanied the pandemic. But look what happened since then. A lot of liquidity floating around out there. A lot of people feeling wealthy. You had, of course, the relief funds, followed by just generally strong, a strong economy. People keep expecting some kind of recession, some kind of downturn. And it reminds me of the great economics joke. Believe it or not, there's a rich vein of economics humor, but one is that forecasters have successfully predicted 12 of the last 4 downturns. We're always looking for a downturn, but just not happening. And that line is going bat out of hell crazy. And that means, what does it mean? It means if you're buying machine tools from you good people, other people have got there first. People building everything from tennis rackets to cars to refrigerators are buying, capital. They're placing capital investments, ordering metal, ordering machine tools, most of all hiring workers. They're doing it before the aircraft industry. And it's a little worse than that, and it gets even worse still. Another problem, of course, is that inflation factor. You can see that below, that, and you can see it's softening a little. Fears of double-digit inflation are abating. Most likely we're heading down to 5% or something, not good, but not tragic. Either way, it's a complication because not everybody in the world of commercial aircraft is completely protected in terms of their contractual provisions. They might have locked in a price that allows for some degree of inflation protection at the prime level, but maybe not at the first or second or third tier supplier level. So as a consequence, they might be struggling with this right now because, for 40 years, we haven't had inflation. You've had a whole generation of people in this industry brought up in a world where, was inflation going to be 1% or 2% or 0%? And now they're wrestling with this. And it's another problem with high defense spending. I'm glad, the defense industry is doing great, but it hires people, a lot of them. And where do they come from? Yeah, well, very often they come from the commercial side of things. If you want to meet a former Boeing worker, you could go to Palmdale and go to the B-21 line. You could go to Fort Worth and go to the F-35 line. Basically, all defense contracts, or I shouldn't say all, but most defense contracts have a greater degree of inflation protection than commercial ones do, which means if you're hiring people, or for that matter, buying machine tools for a defense program, you spend whatever is needed, and you know that the taxpayer is going to reimburse you. That isn't true on the commercial side. You might be subject to limitations. Like I mentioned, not all contracts have pass-through provisions for inflation. So as a consequence, one real complication is what we call crowding out, where high defense spending is starting to crowd out the commercial side of things. That's something we need to watch. Now, it also makes launching new civil products difficult. I'm not unsympathetic to Boeing. If I were them, I would be launching a new jet to compete with Airbus's A321neo. But on the other hand, when the cost of hiring additional engineers to create that new aircraft is so much more expensive because of high defense research and development, it makes closing that business case that much more complicated. So this is an issue to watch for. The funniest thing I've heard in all of this, back when the tech sector started laying people off in a couple of months ago with Meta, Facebook, and Google, and whatever else, and some economics observer, I think, in one of the specialty magazines said, if these people would get jobs in the real economy, aggregate productivity would go up. So my message is, if you were an engineer working on the metaverse, please consider the aerospace universe as a great place to work where you'll do real things and we could use you. So anyway, in the meantime, we're subject to inflation because of a tight labor market. Next page, please. Now, where are the other problems other than labor? Look, a lot of it does come back to labor, but these are the areas of watch. You know, microchips, forging, super alloys, chemicals and resins, engineered components, machine parts. Don't forget labor, labor, and labor. But one new complication that's emerged over the past year is titanium, because it comes from a dangerous neighborhood, pure and simple. There's two forms of titanium, two flavors. One is the sponge, the raw material, in which Russia is about something like 18%, but Kazakhstan's an issue. Japan's really ramped up. Thank you, Japan. China's still providing, everyone's still providing, it's just a concern. But what's a far bigger concern is mill product, castings and forgings, the finished raw material. As far as I can tell, the Russian economy consists of oil, gas, bullets, and for some reason, titanium mill product. Now, there has not been a decision by the Russians to embargo exports of titanium mill product, but there has been a decision by Boeing and others to stop buying it. You know, we've got stockpiles for now, not overly worried. And of course, there are other sources, most notably Howmet, which is doing better and better, as you might expect, as they pick up. The Japanese, again, doing their part. ATI, very good provider. Timet. But that's a big chunk with VSMPO of ISMA, the Russian component of the titanium mill product market. So that's something we need to watch. Things could get a bit tight, especially if wide bodies come back, because wide bodies have a higher percentage of titanium than compared to narrow bodies. And of course, the defense side of things uses lots of titanium. That's also something to watch. My favorite anecdote about titanium is that during the Cold War, we used an awful lot of it to build the SR-71, the legendary Mach 3 spy aircraft in the 60s, and the titanium came from Russia. They cheerfully sold it to us. So I wouldn't worry too much, but on the other hand, it's an area of concern. Next page, please. I'm going to wrap up with this slide, then turn back over to Eric for questions in our last 15 minutes or so. But basically, my objective here is to show what we've come from and where we're going, and have it all baselined back to our glory days of 2019. Not all 2019. If you look at single aisle jets, that's that green line, that had to be baseline to 2018 because you had the MAX production line shut down in 2019. So 2019 fell a little. But let's look at where everything is compared to the peak. There's that bar for 100%. First of all, look at the blue dotted line. That's world GDP, courtesy of the OECD, alphabet soup here, apologies. But basically, that is the global economy. It's come roaring back. It actually made a full recovery in 2021. Keeps going. We're good. Next, look at the dotted maroon line. That is revenue passenger kilometers, RPKs. And that is people flying. And like I said, sometime actually 2024, we are going to get back to where we were. Again, if you're in North America, you're flying in North America, you're flying in Europe, you're already at that 2019 level. This is really just a function of China coming back with the end of its COVID-19 lockdown provisions back about 2 months ago. It's intra-Asia following China. Everything else is all the way back there. Now let's look at everything else. Military, there's that purple line there at the top. Yeah, you know, last year or sometime early this year, I should say, we exceeded output at its peak. That's good. BizAv also this year, single aisle jets this year, rotorcraft this year. It's all happening this year. We're exceeding 2019 peak. The only thing you have to worry about, that very bottom line, that blue, twin aisle jets. That is the only segment that is weak and going to stay that way through the decade. You know, is it unfortunate? Yes. On the other hand, it means, because of the substitution effect, that a lot of that demand has gone over to single aisles and is contributing to the strong health of the single aisle market. So it's not the end of the world. It's just a production complication. the people you were selling machine tools to who are building twin aisles, you're now selling to them as they desperately try to tool up for single aisle production. It's just another complication, I'm afraid, in an already complicated world of aircraft production. And again, boy, it's only production. From a market standpoint, things are excellent. Thanks so much. I'm going to turn over back now to Eric for questions in the remaining 15 minutes.
Thank you, Richard, for unraveling the complex knot of contradictions in the current aerospace markets. It's a very different time than we've seen. I'd like to start with a question. You mentioned, of course, that the biggest hurdle for the supply chain is labor. Are you seeing companies embracing automation or actively courting those metaverse employees that are at Liberty at the moment?
The initiative was mentoring programs and sort of what you might call, university partnerships and community college partnerships. There's some really great ones. I've had the pleasure of touring a few and meet the exceptional young men and women who come out of them and want to join our industry. And that's been great. They're ramping up on that, but it's really tough to pivot on a dime. Are we courting people from the metaverse? I think we are anecdotally. I hear that, Boeing is offering the kind of signing bonuses in Seattle that Amazon used to offer, right? So I guess they are, right? I guess the answer is yes. As for automation, that's a good question. That's a long-term trend. Obviously, a lot of it is a little complicated because, of course, you've had to also reshore some supply lines, particularly regarding China. Whatever was moved over there is now moving back, typically to Mexico, some to Vietnam, whatever else. But some of it that comes to the U.S., obviously, there's a greater premium on automation. It's as you all know, any of you who sell products that it's really tough to turn on a dime with that. I think in the long term, this will probably accelerate thinking in favor of automation. But again, just so tough to turn on a dime with that sort of thing. You can't just replace people overnight.
All right. We have a question here. We touched on with the titanium supply, but what do you see in the supply chain for raw materials other than that, such as nickel alloys and some of the other metals?
Nickel alloy, that is the other metal, right? I mean, nothing really concerns us. I've got people who I work with at Aerodynamic who are way smarter on supply chains than me. And when I ask that very question, it's a great question. The only thing I know, people aren't concerned about aluminum. That, of course, is the biggest thing. They're not concerned about steel. Nickel alloys, particularly for engine components, is a big area of concern. Thankfully, it's less about dangerous neighborhoods and more about refining capacity and whatever else. So it's an area of concern for inflation, and it's one of the biggest contributors to the engine production bottlenecks that we're seeing. Yeah, it's Groucho Marx, duck comes down, engine alloys. You said the word of the day. That's exactly it. Other than that, there's not much I would be overly concerned with.
All right, I'm going to combine a couple of questions here, but they kind of focus on the future of e-fuel and sustainable aviation fuel to reduce carbon emissions. Where do you see that trending?
Yeah, there's an awful lot of talk in that business, and a lot of it, unfortunately, has focused on hydrogen, which, again, I'm talking to people way smarter than me, and all of them are like, let's talk again in 2050 and maybe never. It just doesn't make its way. This is a story about SAF, sustainable aviation fuel. And this, of course, is a question for the chemical engineers. How quickly can this be scaled? We've got a great chemical engineer on our team, and she's kind of, she's very cautiously optimistic. We're not going to get to 2050 net zero. That's for sure. Not with SAF. We'd love to, can't. Are we going to get part of the way there with SAF? Yes, absolutely. And then, of course, SAF, you further divide into two categories. One is feedstocks, where you're limited by, the feedstock, and the other is P2L, power to liquid. And that, of course, is hobbled by your energy source, economics, water availability, all of these things. There's no easy answer. The good news is costs are coming down, scaling is going up. It's just a very slow process. It took the better part of a century for oil to replace coal. hopefully it won't take the same century for SAF to replace oil.
All right. So again, with the sustainability goals, the aircraft manufacturers can't make enough product as it is now. Is there any incentive for them to pursue some of these other ideas like the truss wings and other fuel efficient designs that are, maybe decades away?
Yeah, it depends how you feel about industrial policy, because whether it's in the US or in Europe, industrial policy, spending by governments on technology development and picking winners effectively is back bigly. It is huge again. And that truss wing contract that you mentioned is one example. But there are many others. And indeed, company R&D and defense R&D, as you saw, is also way up. There's some interesting concepts being explored, prop fans, which open rotor engines, which you saw as a concept in the 80s have reemerged as a possible area of interest. Truss wing, I don't know, high aspect ratio wings have been around for a while. We'll see, certainly worth discussing. I'm really interested in blended wing body. That has come back. And I know people see these manta ray beasts and think, I don't know about that. I want a window. But they really do bring a lot of efficiency. They complicate things from a production standpoint. They complicate things from an operation standpoint. But that might be the next big thing. I guess the important thing is, in answer to your question, there's all sorts of stuff going on. And I'm really encouraged by that.
All right. Does that apply also to the engines, the external rotor rebirth and things of that nature?
Absolutely. There are big complications. We had noise and vibration as big issues there back in the 80s. You've got certification issues, obviously. All failures are uncontained. There's no containment. But if you can surmount those problems, you get something that's very, very meaningful in terms of its 20-30% increase in efficiency.
Okay, we have several questions here, and they all focus on urban air mobility. When is that going to be a thing and included in your forecasts? And what do you see, or when do you see that market developing?
Yeah, we've had it for years. It's called a rotorcraft. I don't understand the urban air mobility thing. I really don't. I don't think I ever will. There are certainly interesting designs. There are some companies that aren't targeting, taking people for some reason, flights across town. Because, I could take a cab for $15 or I could pay, $200 for a helicopter. It doesn't really work like that. But there are other people who are prioritizing, high value cargo or military contracts for contested logistics areas or whatever else, like Beta. I think Beta has an interesting message. But there are others like, there's so many at this point, 250 at last count. I just don't understand the business plans for most of them. And I think we're going to see absolute carnage in the next couple of years as most of them fail miserably. There's my special demotivational message. I apologize.
Okay. Here's a very specific question asking about your thoughts on Kevin's recent article on the OEM Tier 1 extended payment terms as cash and cash flow is the real killer to aerospace and defense businesses.
Oh, I thought that article badly needed to be written. Of course, I was a cheerleader for Kevin. I mean, the pain, the obstacles, it's in the second and third tier, right? I mean, we've got to make that situation good. And what you have is almost like this tragedy of the commons where, the guys at the top are saying, poor, poor, pitiful me, but they do have something known as a profit margin and access to capital. And then they're wondering why the supply chain they've spent the last 10 years pummeling isn't able to deliver. Well, it might be because they're a little starved for capital. So accelerated payments for them would be such a smart move. And I sure hope people listen to Kevin.
Okay. You mentioned the wide body market is hurting. How about sales specifically focused on the air freighter market, since that seems to be the one bright spot in that segment?
Yeah, it has. And air cargo demand is still above, it had been crazy above peak, but now it's come down a bit. And boy, a lot of people really piled on to the passenger to freighter conversion market. We've got a really good expert on that, Mike Stengel, who's done some interesting numbers. And it sure seems like there's a lot of capacity coming in. And if we have any kind of downturn, that's going to complicate things. For example, there are 3 777-300ER conversion lines planned. That's a lot of 777-300ERs. Meanwhile, they're still building 777 freight models, 767, A330, A350, all coming, 777XF, all coming. There's a lot of capacity. I'm a little concerned about those numbers, even though right now, yeah, things still are pretty good. So I'm just concerned about overambitious expectations rather than any kind of downturn that brings us below where we were.
Okay. Back to titanium and the supply. How do you see the supply chain for titanium scrap since the production rates during the pandemic led to reduced output of that material?
Yeah, revert, my favorite word. I always like the sound of revert. This market should be functioning well. I imagine it would be great. I remember there was a bit of a kind of a weird paternity suit between the primes and the suppliers about who gets scrap from the floor. I remember when Boeing said, "Hey, that scrap is ours," and I don't know how that was resolved, to be honest. But I imagine that market's doing just great. You saw this with the steel industry back with the mini mills back in the 80s. And when supply is challenged, people find ways around things, and I sure hope that market functions efficiently and it does great. I'm not close enough to know, but it sure seems like revert's a good opportunity.
All right, where do you see the additive manufacturing market and 3D printing going? Since there's a lot of development in the end use of metals in that segment.
Yeah, a little bit perhaps overhyped. That doesn't mean there's not a lot of potential, but it's not going to be the massive ride-up story. As a matter of fact, just the other day, people who were on the ITEP program, which is the M901 GE motor that's going to replace the T700 on Blackhawks and Apaches, said that there's going to be a delay, 6 months, I believe, largely because of components made with additive. In other words, there are complications here. And you're seeing it also, you look at the new engine on the Denali that GE's been devising, the catalyst, is supposed to destroy the Pratt Canada PT6. Doesn't look like that's happening. It looks like additive offers a few nice enhancements, but it's not quite the revolution in manufacturing we were anticipated. But of course, like all other technologies, there's that hype cycle where you expect everything to change overnight. It doesn't. And in the long run, you get dividends. It just takes longer than people think.
All right. Again, with the materials, with only a few mills producing A286 metal, do you see an issue as lead times are growing?
Good question. I'm afraid that's a little bit off my radar horizon.
Okay.
I have an intelligent answer to that.
Okay. F-35 seems to be the once and future fighter jet. Do you see any competition coming along from Europe anytime soon or any of the other?
Yeah, just not anytime soon, right? I mean, it depends where. Right now, Rafael from France is doing really great with markets that don't want to be dependent upon the US. So right now they're selling great to India, Egypt, Qatar, pretty much what you'd expect. And they'll get more of those orders. So it's sort of competition, but sort of not. It's like a different market, really. If you're a US friend or ally and you're going to stay that way, if you're Finland or Canada, Japan, South Korea, Australia, F-35, no competition. But if you're kind of from the non-aligned world, you're going to be looking at alternatives. I'm also intrigued by the merged Tempest F3 program between Japan and Britain. That's not competition until the mid-2030s at the earliest. But as a business concept, boy, that sounds like a perfect marriage.
All right. I think we have time for one more question. And we talked about future flight, but we didn't talk about supersonic. Is that on track for any commercial realization in the next few years?
I sure want to believe, I actually was kind of a believer in the Ariane supersonic business jet. And when that fell apart, I was kind of surprised. It seemed like they had something, but the trade-offs are huge. You're getting speed, but you're paying an awful lot more. And you're getting a lot less cabin too, which was the real problem with Ariane. Boom, people were giving them money. As long as people give them money, they'll keep going. But the idea of them actually producing anything, it just seems kind of bizarre. The big question with the supersonic design is an engine. And Rolls, Pratt, and GE have said, no, thank you. We're not doing a supersonic engine. So boom, cobbled together this weird consortium of random folks to basically do it in their backyards or their parents' basements or something. I can't quite figure it out. But until someone says, here is your supersonic engine, we are developing it for you, then this is a glider. Pure and simple.
Well, we're out of time, Richard, but thank you again for your insightful comments and commentary on aerospace markets. And we can hope for the best here as we move into the summer and fall of 2023. Thank you again to our sponsors, Iskar and Renishaw, Sharon Group, Heidenhain, Bikino, Nagata Engineering, Solar Atmospheres, and Walter. Thank you.
You can find more Manufacturing Matters plus the MFG Radio Network's other podcasts on Apple Music, Spotify, Google Podcast, or on our websites at todaysmedicaldevelopments.com, aerospacemanufacturinganddesign.com, and evdesignandmanufacturing.com.